Mallika Nocco. I am a soil plant water relations and irrigation specialist here at UC Davis. And then, co-presenting and helping me out today is Logan Ebert, who is a graduate student researcher. And we are both a part of the Conservation Irrigation Lab. We are currently a small but mighty lab here at UC Davis. And I'm just gonna give all of you like a 10,000 foot view of thinking about sensing crop water stress with thermal imagery, and I've kind of structured this as more of like a story and a story, like my story and our story, and why we're doing what we're doing, some of the models that we're using, where I think this field is going. So Logan is gonna kind of keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A, and I've told him to feel free to interrupt me if anything kind of comes up that we want to talk through. But here we go. Okay. So we're going to start by just talking a little bit about evapotranspiration or crop water use, and thinking about that, and also the drivers of evapotranspiration and some of the indices that are important for measuring it. And that kind of is what gets us to this place of thinking about it in this spatial sense, in evapotranspiration mapping, as well as crop water stress mapping. Before you understand crop water stress, it is important to understand crop water use. And then we're going to talk about aerial mapping, and I'll share some data and published work that I've done using aerial imaging with a Cessna, and then kind of talk about my transition from using the same type of algorithms with imagery collected from a Cessna to imagery that we're now collecting with drones, and kind of it's been interesting to try to adapt some of the existing models that are out there and algorithms for drones. And I think this is where a lot of the challenge is going to be in thinking through, with all of the data that we can collect, how do we want to process it? And, I study irrigation, and I think a lot of the folks who are in the crop world who are interested in mapping evapotranspiration and crop water stress, the reason you want to do that is because you want to think about how can we better manage water in crops, and how can we better manage nutrients in crops. So I want to talk a little bit about some of those management concerns as well. All right, so just a little bit more of an introduction about me, about our lab. So I call my lab the Conservation Irrigation Lab here at UC Davis. It's a new lab. I started in September of 2017. I moved here from the Midwest, so that's where some of the Wisconsin examples are going to come from. And there are the parts of the work that I do is I'm really focused on this irrigation idea, and thinking about how can we optimize irrigation for co-benefits, thinking about regenerative irrigation and that relationship between water use and soil health, and then also thinking about this precision management and monitoring. And that's how I got interested in drones. So evapotranspiration, this is a cartoon that I like to use because it also includes a fun activity that all of you could maybe try at home. So evapotranspiration is this term that includes evaporation from the soils as well as leaf surfaces, and then transpiration from pores under the leaves, which are called stomata. And I like this. It's like, try this. If you cover a leaf of a plant, you will notice that the plastic bag looks foggy for a while, after a while. This is kind of the basic way to start thinking about crop water use or evapotranspiration. So we call crop water use evapotranspiration. We also think about it as ET. So I'm going to probably use ET for the rest of this talk. I'm also going to monitor my time because I am a chatty person. This is just a landscape of, looking at irrigated agriculture. So you've got these irrigated circles or half circles in a landscape that is rain fed. So just kind of getting at the scope of the problem, getting at why we need to manage water, why we are interested in managing water. What are some of the drivers of crop water use, or ET? These are the drivers, and they're also the stressors, right? So you can think of the drivers and the stressors as similar. So we've got sun, we've got temperature, we've got wind, and we've got humidity. And you can also think about humidity as the vapor pressure deficit, right? So what is the difference in atmospheric vapor pressure in the air? These are the drivers of evapotranspiration. So high temperatures, high winds, full sun, low humidity, a plant is going to use a lot of water and have a high rate of ET and also be stressed out. Oh, here we go. So thinking just about measuring ET, right? So these are there are all these different methods and ways in which we measure ET and ways in which we think about ET. And I think that UAVs or drones are kind of in this place, right? So thinking about precision monitoring of crops, cultivar ID. So for my colleagues who are interested in developing drought resistant cultivars, there's like a great need to do this type of phenotyping work using drones. I just participated on like a project proposal that's interested in doing that kind of work with drones. So some of you might be interested in also doing that type of work. And then this is, what I'm kind of thinking about, which is this precision control, irrigation scheduling, identification of crop stress. And there's several other methods out there, right, to measure ET. And a lot of these methods, lysimetry, aerial sensing, eddy covariance, these are the types of folks that we want to collaborate with and think about to try to validate and calibrate the models of ET and crop water stress that we might be developing using UAVs. So thinking about precision irrigation, it's now, I don't know what that was. It's now technologically feasible, right? There are these variable rate systems out there, especially in folks that are in areas that are using center pivot irrigation. It's very much technologically feasible to do precision irrigation. Here in California, it's becoming more and more feasible as folks are installing these or getting these variable frequency drives. It's becoming more and more possible to implement precision irrigation. And if you want to do precision irrigation or precision fertigation, we need scientifically based decision support in an actionable time frame. That actionable time frame is kind of a big part of the challenge right now. So thinking a little bit more about the imagery, right? So to measure crop stress using drones, this is where you are usually going to want to use a thermal camera and implement thermal imagery in order to sense crop stress. So typically, if you want to sense crop stress alone, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, it might be enough to just have a thermal camera. But if you want to get to this place where you're developing high resolution maps of evapotranspiration, then it's important to have both the thermal imagery and the multispectral imagery. So thinking about the thermal imagery, if you look and think about a crop, getting back to that evapotranspiration definition, right? If a crop has plenty of available water, the stomata, which are the pores on the bottom of the leaves, these like little mouths, they're gonna be open. And there's gonna be this lower leaf temperature because water is going to be lost by transpiration, and there's gonna be evaporative cooling around the leaves. Whereas if you have a stressed out plant, the stomata will be closed, the leaf temperature is gonna be higher, there's less water. And because of that, when you're using thermal imagery to take a picture, right, and take a picture of a cropscape, the crops that have more water stress are going to be warmer, and the plants that are lower stress and have plenty of water are going to be cooler. So that is kind of the underlying science and theory of how we use this imagery to both estimate evapotranspiration and also to detect crop water stress. So as I mentioned, if you want to actually calculate or estimate evapotranspiration and move beyond just stress, it's useful to also have multiband imagery. And typically these 5 bands are very useful because you can calculate many different indices, like whether it's going to be the NDVI, or as we use the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which is called EVI. And I think that a lot was explained in the previous presentation a little bit about how to use this type of imagery. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. But I am going to kind of go into, as I said, I want to share my story with you, which is getting back to this, I was using lysimetry to estimate evapotranspiration in an area in Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Sands region, where there's a large amount of irrigation. And I installed 27 lysimeters as a part of my doctoral work And I thought I had so many lysimeters, I was just gonna know everything about crop water use. But what I found was a ton of spatial variability. And then I kind of got to this place where I was like, well, I want to see a map of this field. I want to get to, I want to understand why I'm seeing such differences in crop water use, in the water budget, in evapotranspiration and drainage, in an area that was kind of considered to be a relatively homogeneous soil type, sandy soils. And this area too, it wasn't considered to be a place that had enough variability in soil texture for precision ag or precision irrigation or precision fertigation to be useful. So, but that's not what I saw in the lysimetry data. So that's where I got to this aerial place. And this is what kind of floors me being here today in this moment at DroneCamp. I started this experiment using this Cessna in 2014. And at that time, it was cost prohibitive. It was time prohibitive. And there was just still so much red tape around using drones to do this experiment. And so I ended up, I had fortunately access and connections to be able to work with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and use a Cessna to collect imagery. So we still use the same type of cameras, right? So there was a multiband camera for multispectral imagery and a thermal camera. So we collected these imagery, we conducted 12 missions over 6 fields. And then the ground measurements that we used, we had the lysimeters as well as concurrent estimates of leaf gas exchange. So we measured the stomatal conductance or opening of those stomata and leaf area index. And we're able to, map ET then. So this is the algorithm that I use. And there are many, many, many algorithms out there for mapping evapotranspiration. All of the algorithms for mapping evapotranspiration use some sort of environmental biophysics to solve the energy budget at a pixel, at each pixel. I use an algorithm that's called HERMIT, or the high resolution of meteorological, or the high resolution evapotranspiration model. And it was developed by Sam Zipper in 2014. And so he was actually a collaborator on this project as well. And so what HERMIT does, and for those who maybe are coming into this with some knowledge of different evapotranspiration models, one of the biggest problems with mapping evapotranspiration using satellite data or using aerial imagery is you have to identify hot and cold pixels. So this model doesn't require that identification of a hot pixel and a cold pixel. And what you end up doing with the hot pixel and cold pixel identification is you use those to scale the values of ET within the image. So HERMIT uses a meteorological station that's on site or very, very close to on site, and makes this assumption that the air temperature is going to be, that the air temperature is going to be equivalent to what the canopy temperature would be if 100% of the energy budget were going to sensible heat flux. And we think of latent heat flux, that component of the energy budget, as almost synonymous with evapotranspiration. It's thinking about evapotranspiration, or the water component is converted to an energy component of the energy budget. So if you can estimate latent heat flux, you can estimate evapotranspiration. And if you can estimate evapotranspiration, you can estimate latent heat flux. So that's just a little bit about the model. This is a little bit about the study that we did. Basically, we were able to map mean evapotranspiration and then make an index out of it, right? So scale that across a single field, so that the units that we use to map evapotranspiration are millimeters per hour. And when we scale it across a field, we have this normalized evapotranspiration index. And this is, this one example, one flight, one field in potatoes. So we have this normalized ET, which is unitless. And what I'm going to tell you that's kind of cool, that was the main finding in this study, is we also use proximal sensing to map soil type and soil properties as a proxy, or basically proximal sensing can be used, and electrical conductivity can be used as a proxy for soil properties. And that's what we did in this study. And that ET map in this case looks a lot like the soil map did. So we found in this particular study, the grower was not using precision irrigation. So it was kind of evaluating, like, is there a potential for better control using precision irrigation? And what we found was that in these specialty crops, there was that potential, in much more so than field corn, where it didn't matter as much, that there were differences, subtle differences in the soils. That was just an application, fun application. But the other kind of technical issue that came out of that study is when we were using aerial imagery, look at, so many of these images are cut off, and they were just the bane of my existence, because we would get all ready to go and then the clouds would come, and there's not a lot that you can do in the Midwest and in anywhere once the clouds are in the air and you're trying to run these missions. So I got really interested in drones because we also did some sensitivity analyses and some Monte Carlo statistics to kind of get some sense of where the uncertainty was in our point-based estimates of evapotranspiration. And one of the largest drivers of uncertainty in those estimates was shortwave radiation, which is changing because of clouds. So I really wanted to kind of have more flexibility around our missions, where we could wait until a cloud passed and we had no clouds over the field of interest before we could fly, or just kind of have this opportunity to time things a little bit better and have more flexibility. And that's how I got interested in using drones. And I was, as I mentioned, I was interested in 2014, it just couldn't happen then. So by the time, this study was published and I was thinking about the next steps in just my life, my professional life, MicaSense had released this camera. So in 2019, MicaSense released this Altum, and I was just like, whoa, this is everything that I'd hoped for, because I also had spent a lot of kind of time and heartache trying to deal with the post-processing of my images that were coming in, the multispectral images and the thermal images that were coming in from 2 different cameras, and trying to co-register those. That was a pain. So it was really, really nice, the idea of having everything coming in at one camera. And I was fortunate to be able to invest in this particular setup, which is a DJI Matrice 210 plus the MicaSense Altum. So that's what my group is using now. And in 2019, another wonderful thing happened in Wisconsin while I was doing my postdoctoral work, which is a colleague, Professor Ankur Desai, put in this eddy covariance tower. And that actually, once this tower went in, I was just like, man, I gotta get a drone. There can't be a tower on the ground without us collecting imagery around it, because it's so wonderful to be able to have colleagues. And out here at UC Davis, I collaborate a lot with Dr. Kusana Subacharov, who also works with these eddy flux towers. If you're thinking about building maps of evapotranspiration, you also want to think of ways to try to validate and calibrate the data. So in 2019, Logan, who is here right now, really led all of these missions and kind of became an expert on this system. And you can see us doing the radiometric calibration that Dr. Mogimi was talking about in our last talk, or collecting imagery to do the radiometric calibration with this particular drone setup. This is the MicaSense panel. And we conducted several missions. Obviously, these clouds are a problem on that particular day, but it was such a great glamour shot, we had to take it. So I want to talk a little bit, so much time has been spent wonderfully on radiometric calibration. I want to talk about calibrating or thinking about that surface temperature. And MicaSense at this moment, the official word on the issue is that the temperature estimates from the Altum should not be used for, it should not be used for temperature estimates, like to make a map of temperature. They want you to use it relatively. And it's because it's a little bit uncertain as to how much correction or calibration needs to happen with these surface temperature that's captured using a forward-leaning infrared camera and a drone. And what the literature kind of gets into, if you do a deep dive, and we did a deep dive, is that 30 meters, if you're flying 30 meters or lower, you probably don't need to do an atmospheric correction. You're so close to the ground. And the question becomes, what about if you're flying between 30 meters and 90 meters, which is, I think, where most of us are collecting this imagery? Do you need to do the atmospheric correction? And I know a lot of folks who are doing atmospheric corrections with aerial imagery are finding that it's not changing very much if they do those corrections. So one of the things that we are working on right now is trying to kind of answer this technical question, and just we're doing that by collecting ground measurements and basically collecting ground measurements of canopy temperature and surface temperature while these flights are happening. And it's, I think, important to collect those measurements if you want to use the temperature as is, right? If you want to either do a correction and use the temperature as is, but if you are more interested in using the temperature in this relative sense, you may not be as interested in doing that. So here's kind of our first maps that we've made of ET using the drone imagery. And we use that same Hermit algorithm. We need meteorological data. This is a map of canopy surface temperature from the potato fields in the Wisconsin Central Sands. And then a map of enhanced vegetation index. And when we use the magic of physics and basically compute an energy budget for every single pixel, we're able to output a map of ET. One of kind of the interesting computational things that happened going from aerial imagery with the Cessna to the drone is I went from having to compute ET at 40 to 80,000 points to now having 1 million to 3 million points. So all of a sudden it took a lot longer to run the model. And that's been kind of interesting to deal with and to think about going forward. Here's just kind of a flow chart of how our process works. So we have, the imagery that's coming in from the camera. So our calibration image, metadata, the different bands, the thermal. So we're going, I think maybe some came to the Metashape workshop. We use Metashape. So we do a radiometric calibration, alignment, reconstruction. We have an orthomosaic. And then we are actually, because leaf area index and some of the canopy cover concerns are we actually have to aggregate our pixels to be thinking in that canopy cover sense, because it is, like for leaf area index, for example, it's meters squared of leaf per meter squared of ground. So we aggregate and make the calculation and disaggregate. And we have to do some unit conversions, and basically this is kind of what happens with our process in terms of using the Hermit model. Because I know I don't have too much time left, I do want to talk about what if you don't care about actual evapotranspiration using a drone. And maybe you don't need to care about that, right? Like, so if you're just interested in figuring out how much stress there may be on a given field, you maybe don't need to have this actual evapotranspiration value, right? And then there's another index that's really valuable and interesting called the crop water stress index that you can use. And here's the formula for it. This index still needs to be, still potentially needs to be calibrated at your site, because it's a normalized index, right? You're taking that canopy temperature estimate and you're normalizing it. So you need to have some sense of what the high baseline temperature would be for a given crop and what the low baseline temperature would be for a crop. So what is the canopy temperature of a crop when it's as stressed out as it can be? And what is the canopy temperature gonna look like when it's happy, healthy, and rocking it in terms of its ET? So those, and there are literature values for a variety of crops in a variety of places, but that's just something to consider. So here are kind of two examples that could happen. Like there's some theoretical values and estimates where maybe you don't want to do this empirical work and develop a baseline for your crops. There's some theoretical approaches to figuring out what the high and low baseline could be. And then there's also some empirical formulas that are already out there for thinking through what the high and low baseline could be for a given crop. So that's another approach if you just don't want to get into the mess of evapotranspiration, but you're still interested in getting at crop water stress. And this, I think, could be more useful and ready to get to that place of offering in-field decision support from the drone data, which is very important to distinguish between like, what are we interested in for research and what are we interested in for that in-field decision support. And that now I'm going to start wrapping it up here. So future work and bigger questions. I feel like this area of study is very like ripe. There's many questions. There's so much work to do. So for all of you that have tuned in, like, I'm so happy you're here. You know, feel free to get in touch with me if you want to think through something. One of the things that I want to put out there that I've been thinking a lot about is just how do we improve or even maybe reconceptualize existing spatial evapotranspiration models to take advantage of all the additional information we're getting from drones, right? So I feel that by using the model, and this can be Hermit, this can be any of the ET models that are out there, right? They all have some sort of index, NDVI, you know, EVI, some sort of ground cover estimate. But as we saw in the last group of presentations by the folks at the Digital Ag Lab, there's so much more structural information that's to be had. Is there a way to kind of reconfigure or reconceptualize our evapotranspiration models to take advantage of those structural data? And is there a way to do that and still offer in-season real-time decision support? And I don't know the answer to that question, right? So that might be a trade-off that's out there that in terms of getting to a place where we can process the data and offer real-time decision support. And that's kind of the other question that I have is like, what do we actually need from UAVs to offer support for decision, for irrigation management? And so those are kind of some of the, you know, what do we need versus what do we want kinds of questions. And then how do we scale is a question that we're working on in my group, right? So we have this problem where you capture images of ET, right? And it's an instantaneous estimate of ET in millimeters per hour. How do we scale that from millimeters per hour to millimeters per day? And then how do we scale that in between image collection dates? And there's some ways that have been suggested for doing this type of scaling with satellite-derived estimates of evapotranspiration, but how can we apply them to drones in the same way? So those are some questions that we're exploring right now. So a few more final thoughts. I think we're about 5 to 10 years from in-season actionable ET mapping with drones, but the crop water stress indices are pretty much here. So I think that if you are here and you came to my talk because you want to advise growers and you know, build out indices to help them, to support them right here, right now, I would focus on those crop water indices and trying to make sure you can calibrate and validate them for your area, for the crops of interest that you have wherever you are. And the other thing is, you know, what is decision support going to look like for different user groups when it comes to crop water stress? So depending on the actual tech in place, right? Like, are you in a place where there is variable rate irrigation and it's being used, you know, with center pivots, for example? Or are you in a place where the growers really aren't quite there in terms of the tech in place to implement irrigation like that? So like, what's useful? That's another thing to consider. And then I just think that, you know, one method isn't and will not do it all. So, you know, for folks who are married to satellites and are really like excited about satellite-based estimates of ET, I think there's a place for that. I think there's a place of drone-based estimates for the drone-based estimates that we're kind of checking out and focusing on in my research group. But I also think there's a lot of really cool stuff happening with fixed canopy temperature estimates, and those are very useful too. So I think that we need these concerted research efforts in order to build like very robust information systems and models. So thank you so much. It's 3:35, so I don't know if we have time for questions or there are any.